Welcome everyone. Today our focus is on conflict and pastoral governance. These have been covered obliquely earlier in the course, including on topics of class dynamics and social difference, markets, and land and tenure. Insurgency, rebellion, and militarization have long been associated with pastoralism in different places. In previous sessions, we've seen that conflict is indeed important for understanding dynamics of uncertainty and difference in pastoral societies. In the session on class dynamics, we reviewed perspectives on critical agrarian political economy, drawing on Marxian perspectives on the causes and consequences of class conflict between the bourgeois, the owners of the means of production, and the capitalists, and the proletariat, the working classes and the poor. Yet Marx's emphasis on class conflict as constituting the dynamics of social change and his view of social relations as based on power have not translated into understandings of conflict in pastoral areas, as we'll see. Far more significant have been ideas around resource scarcity, an outlook born from environmental determinism and the assumption that scarce grazing resources drive competition between livestock keeping units. Concerns around the impacts of global climate change have further elevated scarcity perspectives in recent years, spawning an entire cottage industry and studies that seek to assess the associations between rainfall patterns, forage availability, and livestock grazing. Pastoralists, of course, inhabit the borderlands of nation-states, and some suggest that there are strong associations between remoteness and conflict. Similarly, border areas subsumed in regional conflicts have been theorized as particular areas where low-intensity conflict, gun crime, and social violence occur. Yet it would be wrong to approach this in terms of a geographic determinism. After all, borderlands themselves are constructions of geopolitics and nation-state governance. They are historically constituted. Developing this point further, Jonathan Goodhand, a key thinker on conflict and governance in borderlands, explains that many wars have been and are fought in border regions that have a historical experience of marginality and ambiguous relationship with the state. There is a literature that points piecemeal to a trend of war and conflict being fought in borderlands, but there are huge regional variations. However, what is not questioned is the tradition of marginal areas being beyond the control of the state, a phenomenon that has been apparent for as long as states have been drawing political administrative boundaries. This is especially true for pastoral areas, where state-society relations have often been tenuous, where the state itself was an actor in conflict in many places, and where governance and day-to-day life has been the work of hybrid arrangements, incorporating a whole range of actors beyond the state. We'll come back to these themes, but I want to begin with a vignette of violence and people's responses to the existence of conflict as being something that is deeply embedded and persistent over time. And our vignette comes from Turkana County, an expansive area in the northwest corner of Kenya, bordering Uganda, South Sudan, and Ethiopia, the red area on the map you see here. Within Turkana, we focus on the riparian settlements along the Turkwell River that bisects southern Turkana, indicated by the blue line running up and down in the map in the left-hand corner. Violence is palpable and ever-present threat in the towns and villages of South Turkana. However, no telling of a conflict incident is complete without also considering how the threat of violence is tempered through careful planning and preparation. In March 2004, a group of Ingoroko, or bandits, numbering between 200 and 300, attacked the neighboring settlements of Lopur and Katilu, adjacent settlements on the east bank of the Turkwell River, indicated by the blue star on the map, where pastoralists have settled in and around the remnants of an old irrigation scheme. Most residents also still keep and move animals. A seed group of young men originated from the plains stretching west from the river. They proceeded southwards, the group's number growing in size as they crossed the Turquoise River. The ever-expanding gang moved beyond Lokapel, a settlement about 10 kilometers north of Katilu that is notorious for harboring professional livestock thieves. They infiltrated into Katilu and Lapur, surreptitiously following the river and taking cover in nearby woods. The gang divided into small groups, opportunistically demanding small numbers of animals, including valuable bulls and camels from young men, and boys looking after the animals at the grazing and browsing sites. They also attacked women who were traveling on foot to their shambas, or gardens and farms. The gang acted with impunity. Among the crimes they allegedly committed were assault, rape, theft, and the murder of 3 villagers. The outnumbered and under-equipped Kenya police reservists, or local villagers who are licensed and armed by the police, ostensibly to maintain security, and there were 20 of them at the time in Lapur. The Kenya Police Unit and other administrative police offered no defense or protection. People were left to take their own precautions, including limiting movement to the riparian areas where browse and pasture are plentiful, but which provide cover to Ngoroko who are attracted to the large herds using such areas. Herds boys were driving the animals out from the night crawls much later in the morning as well, leaving as late as 8 in the morning. The chief had separated his prized he-goats and calves from the rest of the herd and zero-grazed these within his sprawling compound to prevent them from being lost at grazing sites. Everyone was living in fear. Residents lamented the government's inability to provide adequate security. Several labeled the Ngoroko with the derogatory term Turkana Pokats. Pokat are a neighboring agro-pastoral society and the customary foes of the Turkana. Thus, by calling the bandits Turkana Pokat, area residents were suggesting they were enemies. The fact that they were Turkana themselves only heightened levels of anxiety. This attitude reflected a perceived change in the behavior of Ngoroko. Their actions in the past were synonymous with gift-giving, more than they were stealing, since they had acted within the framework of the moral economy, as opposed to outside as they are thought to do now, by requesting donations of animals and food, and later returning livestock obtained from raiding to villagers who had helped Ngoroko on their way to raid. Little distinction, in fact, was made between the Pokat and Ngoroko in terms of the harm they cause. Women feared being attacked when on their way to shambas or while gathering wild foods. These activities were temporarily halted. Several women and children living nearest to the river were displaced and sleeping rough in Lopur village center or at the homes of relatives and friends. People also feared for the safety of the herds boys, who were especially susceptible to attack while grazing animals in fields adjacent to the river. The Ngoroko, through assault and threat of attack, effectively severed access to diverse food sources for as long as they remained near to the village. Yet, residents were highly adept at responding to the threat. Activities were curtailed and movements restricted as the attacks were felt in neighboring villages. At a time before the spread of the mobile phone, word of an impending assault traveled quickly, warning villagers in advance that they needed to make preparations to protect life and property. And life quickly returned to normal as Ngoroko moved onwards to towns and villages further on. Understandably, these attacks were much easier to bear for those with larger herds and more help with domestic chores or farm work. The loss of a few animals was mourned but manageable. However, the loss of even a few animals was devastating for those with a small herd, particularly for elderly widows and single mothers. Although only a few in number, a small herd is deeply important to an individual's prestige and place in the community. Possessing a few animals is also a tangible connection to the local moral economy. As various residents put it, being without animals is felt like death and signals the inevitable retreat into a different economic and social sphere that is felt as alien, subservient, and unsettling. These attacks had a profound impact, noticeable even to an outside observer. However, there was also an apparent getting on with life in spite of the attacks. The objective was to persevere, to minimize the probability of a large loss by taking measures to defend and protect the herd, as well as taking immediate action to recover. These attacks could easily be paralyzing and horribly destabilizing to a communal sense of security. Yet the threat of being attacked was incorporated into the planning of all aspects of a livelihood. There was an acceptance of the risk and the rearranging activities around the perceived risk. There is a fine but critical distinction between acceptance and resignation in this instance. Resignation suggests defeat and hopelessness, the inevitable disintegration or coming undone of so much investment, effort, and accumulation. Acceptance is acknowledgement of the threat and planning the protection and recovery according to its probability. So what does this vignette show us? First, it indicates the nature of conflict that pastoralists in many places live with. These are not classic Civil War settings where there is intense fighting, long-lasting displacement, and formalized peace processes. Second, conflict, while being something less intense, is deeply embedded in social organization, livelihood activities and resource use patterns, and marketing activity. Within the study of conflict, as we'll see, there is a great interest in identifying its causes or drivers, as if by diagnosing the source, it can be isolated and removed in such a way as to permit a return to peaceful and stable conditions. As we will see later, conflict has been treated as a type of so-called development in reverse, rather than as a condition inherent in society, and one that relates closely to processes of social and economic change. This takes us to a third and final point I want to make here, is that it shows how conflict is governed at the margins of the state. The state is missing in action often. Indeed, at the time of the attacks on Lapore and Katilu in 2004, it took 3 days for subnational political administration to respond. And then it was only to gather intelligence and reports from residents directly affected. No support was given. Instead, people coped mostly through their own horizontal networks, as well as local governance structures. This vignette sets up our consideration of the shifting nature of conflict in pastoral areas, its possible drivers, as well as state-society relations in these places. And we'll come back to all of these themes later. To develop a clearer idea of more recent outlooks on conflict and governance in pastoral areas, we need to trace back to earlier accounts of customary warfare that emerged from ethnographic and historical analyses of pastoralist societies. Many of these, inadvertently as may have been the case, glorified notions of warfare and warriorhood in pastoral societies, perpetuating the notion of a backward and violent social order that was in need of pacification. Still, these accounts showed that pastoralist warfare in the form of raids was highly governed and strictly controlled, with often limited goals and low lethality. Historians like John Lampier, who wrote a military history of the Turkana, explain that a code of etiquette governed clashes between Turkana herders and their rivals, who wielded spears, shields, and wrist knives in battle. An edited collection of papers in 1979 on warfare amongst East African herders by the anthropologist Katsuyoshi Fukui and David Turton challenged the warrior stereotype, while offering new perspective at the time on understanding the motivations and aims of war among pastoral societies. They stressed the significance, on the one hand, of a desire to attain individual prestige through killing, as well as the motive of acquiring cattle or territorial expansion, though they noted that the aims of war are not usually expressed by those involved in terms of practical objectives. Others, including Lampier, have shown that occupation of new territory was a secondary or unintended consequence of pastoralist expansions, which had more to do with what he said was impoverished individuals anxious to build up herds. Pre-colonial raiding served a redistributive function, transferring animals across social boundaries in situations of need, such as during drought, or when young men sought animals to pay out as bride price. Also important in this discussion of conflict are the different terminologies used by herding societies to describe warfare. Foucault and Turton note that depending on the scale of the interaction, war can be described as, among others, full-scale war, armed fights, reciprocal raiding, or cattle raids. This conceptualization of different scales of conflict and the different ways in which people speak about violence is particularly useful for disentangling the various levels of conflict situations, which emerge from accounts of violence as detailed by the residents of Lepore and Katilu. Earlier literature on pastoralist societies, especially that covering Eastern African settings, addressed possible connections between conflict and identity. Scholars like Gunter Schley, Richard Waller, and Thomas Spear showed that group differences were given expression through exchange among other modes of social interaction across ethnic borders. This confirms the now widely held opinion of Frederick Barth, a Norwegian anthropologist of Iranian Basari herders, that social interaction and acceptance of ethnic differences are the foundation of embracing social systems. Arguing in the 1960s, he emphasized ethnic boundaries that define groups rather than the cultural content enclosed within boundaries. He contended boundaries persist despite a flow of people across them. In other words, categorical ethnic distinctions do not depend on an absence of mobility, contact, and information, but do entail social processes of exclusion and incorporation, whereby discrete categories are maintained despite changing participation and membership in the course of individual life histories. By focusing on the interconnectedness of ethnic identities, Barth parted with older anthropological notions of cultures as bounded entities and ethnicity as primordialist bonds. Writing of the Mercy, an agro-pastoralist group in the Omo Delta region of southwestern Ethiopia, just north of Turkana, Oxford anthropologist David Turton has explained that warfare is, quote, a means by which the very idea of an ethnic group as an independent political unit is created and kept alive. He contends that warfare is a form of ritual resolution of disputes between the Mercy and their neighbors. He says warfare is a reciprocal activity by means of which groups assert their independence of each other and enter into orderly rule-governed relations. Viewed in this way, then, warfare is not a breakdown in normal political relationships, but instead is their very underpinning. So far we have considered conflict as a type of interaction within and between pastoralist societies. Yet pastoralist encounters with the state and state building as a process of military and administrative measures to expand the state's authority opens up another level of conflict for us to understand. State violence against pastoralists over time was justified as part of a civilizing mission to bring peace and impose a new social order. Returning to Turkana, up to 1926, southern parts of Turkana were ruled as part of the Turkana military district and cut off from the rest of the Kenya colony. Beginning in 1915, the King's African Rifles launched a brutal military campaign to counter Turkana raids on their southern neighbors, namely the Pokot. Pokot herders abandoned rangelands near to the Turkana frontier after Turkana warriors mounted a series of raids against the Pokot between 1915 and 1917. As Pokots sought reprieve by migrating southwards, they moved closer to settler farms in Trans Nzoia, part of what was then the White Highlands, a region that is rich with farming lands that had been appropriated by the colonial state for white settlers. Colonial officials feared Turkana aggression would push Pokot tribesmen and herds up against the boundary of white settler farms. In response, the King's African Rifles carried out a sweeping, punitive expedition against the Turkana, recalled in Turkana as the scattering time, in reference to the desperation of Turkana who sought escape by scattering across the bush. In his military history of the Turkana, Lampier characterizes the King's African Rifles campaign against the Turkana people as a quote-unquote total war, in which casualties from disease, starvation, and attacks from northern neighbors resulted in approximately 14% of the Turkana population perishing. He comments, and I quote, "There would be no qualms of the British administration about starving the Turkana into submission or in shattering physically and psychologically their fundamental will to resist." For imperialists in Kenya, the use of wide-scale violence against the Turkana was important to making the colonial state, pacifying warlike pastoralist societies, and protecting and promoting white settler capital. Parallels are evident with Charles Tilley's work on the formation and consolidation of the European state system through wars. His main idea is that war-making and state-making are co-constitutive. States make war, and war makes states. He argued that war helped rulers to disarm domestic rivals, concentrating coercive power in the hands of the ruler. It also spurred the development of state apparatuses, such as bureaucracies, to extract taxes from society to finance the war effort, as well as courts of law to enforce the rights of property owners, whose accumulation of capital ensured there would be adequate resources available to sustain war. Unsurprisingly, institutions of the state that were introduced, subnational political administration, and other elements of the security apparatus, were not trusted by local communities in Turkana or elsewhere in Eastern Africa, where wide-scale violence against pastoralists was official policy of colonial states and other central authorities. The response of pastoralists in many places was to seek to escape the state's reach. Physically, culturally, economically, and politically removed from the calculus of power of the central state, many East African herding societies and areas resisted incorporation, avoiding taxation, resisting external imposition, and maintaining an apparently warlike stance in relation to state efforts. In the book Pastoralism and Development in Africa, Ian, Andy Catley, and myself draw comparisons between these societies and the mobile Swidden agriculturalists of the Southeast Asian highlands that James Scott details in his book, The Art of Not Being Governed. As Scott explains, hill peoples operate outside the reaches of state authority, or at least resisting it at every turn. He argues that this grouping of peoples inhabiting a transboundary region that he refers to as Zomia requires its own history, which needs to be counterposed with the standard national histories of the rice-growing valley states. Although on the Horn the topographic distinction is reversed, the differences are further accentuated by deep, historically rooted cultural and religious differences. Livestock keeping, nomadic, and mostly Sufi-adhering Muslims at the margins, confronting a highland, agriculturally based Orthodox Christian state in Ethiopia, or a Wahhabi-influenced Islamic state in the former Sudan, having to deal with animist or Christian pastoralists in the south. So we're going to pivot now to look at explanations for post-Cold War conflicts. And with these historical accounts in mind, we want to understand what the recent literature has had to say beyond pastoral areas about what the causes and drivers are of contemporary warfare. And this is a field of work that has grown enormously since the end of the Cold War in particular, reflecting broader changes in global patterns of conflict. There has been a steep reduction in interstate wars and a spike in civil wars, as well as a proliferation of social and political violence outside of settings characterized by conflict. The figure on the right shows this graphically. Colonial warfare, shown in green, tails off in the 1970s, and interstate conflict, shown in blue, drops from a peak in the 1960s to very few since the 1990s. By far the great proportion of conflict in red is intrastate conflict, followed by intrastate conflict with external group support, such as what we see today in Syria and Yemen. Mary Calder's book on New and Old Wars was a marker in describing and characterizing the characteristics of violence in the post-Cold War setting. Calder argued that violence has shifted from primarily state-oriented conflicts involving a mass of soldiers and centralized top-down planning to a series of hybrid or low-intensity conflicts that involve private contractors, paramilitaries, and illegal sponsors. Crucially, civilians are rational targets for such new wars, instead of being unintended collateral damage, and this is because new wars are driven by exclusive and often extreme forms of identity politics, she argued. Violence is often part of the historical circumstances of many situations of ongoing civil war. Evidence shows that 90% of civil wars in the period between 2000 and 2010 occurred in countries that had already had a civil war in the previous 30 years. Thus, legacies of conflict matter enormously for the possibility of a country relapsing into conflict. We've also seen in the example of the Turkana, but a point made more broadly by Mark Duffield, is that war has been a way of social restructuring associated with the development of the modern and centralized nation-state. The French sociologist Henri Lefebvre, drawing on Marxian notions of political economy, makes the point that violence is also coupled with the spread of capitalist relations. In many cases, armed violence and war are foundational and persist beyond the beginning of particular institutions or social orders, and in this respect they are not characteristic of development in reverse, as this is commonly understood, according to Chris Kramer's 2006 book on Civil War is Not a Stupid Thing. This implies that conflict must be explicitly addressed and accepted as a common feature in many societies, rather than ignored or seen as an abnormal deviation from an otherwise normal and peaceful development trajectory. With a proliferating number of new wars emerging in the 1990s, environmental explanations of conflict came to the fore. The argument ran that there was an environmental crisis unfolding in different parts of the world, and that scarcity aggravated by population growth and the impacts of global warming was precipitating a societal breakdown and wider conflict. The extremist views of Robert Kaplan, an American journalist for The Atlantic Monthly, epitomizes this Malthus with guns perspective, to use the words of the anthropologist Paul Richards, who wrote a well-received account of the underpinnings of Sierra Leone's civil war in the 1990s, called Fighting for the Rainforest. Richards was referring to the work of Thomas Malthus, an English cleric writing in the 19th century, who predicted that population growth would outstrip the pace of agricultural production and the resource base. This view has been updated by so-called neo-Malthusians who argue that resource scarcity and unmet food needs will result in various social tensions, hatreds, and violence. Kaplan traveled through West Africa in the early 1990s and wrote an assessment of the region based on his journey in a 1994 piece entitled The Coming Anarchy. He later expanded his views in a book by the same name, which you see here on the slide. And here are some quotes from his original 1994 piece. West Africa is becoming the symbol of worldwide demographic, environmental, and societal stress in which criminal anarchy emerges as the real strategic danger. Thomas Malthus, the philosopher of demographic doomsday, is now the prophet of West Africa's future. And West Africa's future eventually will also be that of most of the rest of the world. Future wars will be those of communal survival, or in many cases, caused by environmental scarcity. But putting that to the side for a moment and returning to Chris Kramer's work, he showed that the shortcomings of traditional depictions of civil wars as simple confrontations between two sides, as explosions of mindless violence, or as disrupting apparently benevolent development processes within countries. As Kramer put it, civil war is not a stupid thing. Economists and political scientists have added to these critiques arguing that traditional approaches did not fully take into account the rational economic calculations that drive many contemporary civil wars. As David Keane, a scholar of war-affected and humanitarian situations, explains, one of the limitations of past approaches to conflict and violence is that they, quote, tended to regard conflict as simply a breakdown in a particular system, rather than as the emergence of another alternative system of profit and power. Thus, in order to understand violence in civil wars, we need to understand the economic dimensions underpinning it. One of the most influential works in this respect on the economic causes of civil war is by Paul Collier and Anke Hoffler in a 2000 paper for the World Bank, in which they distinguish between greed and grievance drivers. They asked whether civil wars are caused by political repression, inequality, or religious and ethnic differences, and whether and what roles do factors other than grievance play in rebellion. The key point they made is that rebellion needs both motivation and opportunity. Literature from economic theory models rebellion as an industry that generates profit from looting. They developed an econometric model for predicting the incidence of civil wars, which included factors such as the availability of finance, the cost of rebellion, military advantage, population, and ethnic tensions. And they argued that greed, not grievance, is the driving force, and that opportunity is more important than motive. However, their model has been widely criticized for its conceptual flaws, for its economic reductionism, and for failing to see rebels and insurgents as anything else than simple bandits devoid of any political agenda. David Keane adds to this, differentiating between two types of economic violence: top-down, which is incited by political leaders and entrepreneurs, and bottom-up, where violence is actively embraced by ordinary people, either civilians or low-ranking soldiers. The existence of valuable commodities and rebel movements that lack strong external financier support are among the conditions that can encourage top-down economic violence, such as pillage, controlling or monopolizing trade, and gaining access to land, water, and mineral resources. Bottom-up violence can be triggered by deep social and economic exclusion, the absence of strong revolutionary organization, and impunity for violent acts. And these speak to grievances, to which we turn to now. One of the most influential narratives used to explain and analyze the emergence of violent group mobilization and violent conflict is the theory of relative deprivation. Ted Gurr has developed this theory most fully in his well-known book, Why Men Rebel. Gurr examined the psychological frustration-aggression theory, which argues that the primary source of the human capacity for violence is the frustration-aggression mechanism. Frustration does not necessarily lead to violence, Gurr says, but when it is sufficiently prolonged and sharply felt, it often does result in anger and eventually violence. Gurr explains this hypothesis with his term relative deprivation, which is the discrepancy between what people think they deserve and what they actually think they can get. Recent scholarly debates around intergroup inequality have redeveloped this argument. Some econometric studies find little connection between intergroup inequality and conflict. Farron and Layton and Collier and Hoffler's work is important here. Yet such studies only looked at vertical inequality, or inequality among individuals or households in a society. In contrast, there is increasing evidence that the presence of horizontal inequalities, or inequalities among groups, raises the risk of conflict. A key thinker here is Francis Stewart, who argues that where there are social, economic, and political inequalities coinciding with cultural differences, culture could become a powerful mobilizing agent that can lead to a range of political disturbances, including violent conflict and civil war. Stewart explains that horizontal inequalities occur along a number of dimensions, including economic, where it is not just income, but land ownership and employment, among other aspects that are relevant to people's well-being and grievances. Social dimensions, such as access to health and education. Political dimensions, encompassing participation and control in central and local government. And cultural dimensions, including societal respect for a group's religious practices, language, or dress. So, dominant narratives and theories on civil war in the 21st century have thus focused on the search for an understanding of motives for rebellion and insurgency. As Didier Peclard and Delphine Mechoulan explain, there has been a remarkable convergence of different perspectives around the idea that the post-Cold War upsurge in violence was associated with state failure or decay. Civil wars, so the argument runs, were either the expression of states' inability to maintain their monopoly over the use of violence, or the result of their structural weakness, their collapse, and degeneration into nightmarish shadow or quasi-states, void of popular legitimacy and administrative capacity. Against such reductionism that underlays accounts like these, they instead focus on an emerging field of work that examines the politics of civil war. As they explain, civil wars do not simply destroy political orders. Rather, they contribute to shaping and producing them. Civil wars, in other words, are part and parcel of processes of state formation, and therefore it is incumbent to understand the governance patterns that emerge between so-called war and peace. The work of Zachariah Mampili is influential here in an emerging field of work around rebel governance. Mampili explains that the most important challenge for insurgency is how to resist, I quote, the brutal efficiency of coercive tools if they hope to mobilize civilians behind their cause. The degree to which rebels engage in the development of a system of civilian rule and a bureaucratic apparatus vary greatly, as does their political legitimacy among the populations they control. Whether or not former armed rebel movements are successful in their transition to legitimate political parties in a post-Civil War context is strongly linked to their ability to construct their legitimacy during conflict. Force alone is not enough to sustain rebel rule. Non-state armed actors must legitimize their control in order to survive and prosper, Mampili explains. In so doing, they seek to shift from more coercive means into more durable and legitimate forms of local-level governance, constructed around alliances with local, pre-existing forms and institutions of civilian rule, which might also include the remnants of the central state's administration. Critiques of liberal peacebuilding, based on the notion Kramer critiqued that war is development in reverse, emphasize the need to understand such hybrid political and security orders as the basis for moving to more peaceful and stable conditions over the longer term. Sizing up the state of the debate on hybrid security governance, Niagale Bagayoko, Ibo Hutchful, and Robin Luckham provide this definition of hybridity: the multiple sites of political authority and governance where security is enacted and negotiated, including the multiple ways traditional, personal, kin-based, or clientelistic logics interact with modern, imported, or rational actor logics in the shifting historical conditions of particular national and local contexts. From the 2000s, scholars began to use the notion of hybrid political orders to analyze state formation and peacebuilding processes in post-conflict settings like East Timor, or in Somaliland, as addressed in Marlene Render's book on state building with traditional leaders and institutions. This work has emphasized the vibrancy of hybrid political orders as mechanisms of governance, as something inherently innovative resulting from the broader social and political restructuring that happens through the course of war. Conceptually, hybrid political orders incorporate traditional, customary, or informal institutions. These are often celebrated, but Bagayoko cautions that we must not assume a priori that tradition works better for all citizens, and may encompass regressive and even violent features. The point they make is that informal and formal mechanisms of governance are complementary and contradictory. Informal institutions undergird the state, supplement and subsidize the functioning of its institutions, and provide it with a modicum of resiliency, but at the same time they erode its rational legal norms. What emerges are dual, overlapping hierarchies and systems of power in which both modern and traditional elites are invested. Hybridity has helped to address the normative shortcomings of the state failure literature, offering new lenses to conceptualize state and political authority, not only in transitions out of conflict, but in areas that experience varying degrees of limited statehood. Tobias Hogman and Didier Peclard, in their book Negotiating Statehood, begin from the premise that state construction is a dynamic and undetermined process in which local, national, and transnational actors forge and remake the state through negotiation, contestation, and bricolage. Domination, they argue, is never or rarely exerted exclusively by one power, but it is rather the product of multiple powers. The institutional structure of the state and the balance of power between the center of the state and its margins is continuously negotiated. Day-to-day governance over areas such as security, basic services, and the regulation of markets is characterized by the coexistence and interaction of multiple state and non-state providers, as the state shares authority, legitimacy, and capacity with other actors, networks, and institutions across the formal and informal divide. These are also part and parcel of how states continue to form at the periphery. And so we can return to northern Kenya for an example of how this has played out. Institutions of the state, the provincial administration, and other elements of the security apparatus were not trusted by local communities, as we discussed before. They were something that people sought to escape from in various ways. Power did not necessarily reside in state institutions, but rather in a constellation of actors adjacent to state institutions, such as itinerant traders, arms runners, traditional leaders, prominent fighters and sharpshooters, and respected herdsmen. Traditional leaders, including prophets, soothsayers, clan leaders, and elders, were key figures involved in negotiating tensions across clan and ethnic boundaries, as well as within groups. These non-state and informal systems were not necessarily competing with formal structures for authority and power, but rather they executed the core functions of security and governance in places that were far from Nairobi. Recognizing the importance of these non-state and informal actors to the functioning of political systems at the margins, beginning in the late 1990s, the central government in Kenya invited peace-building approaches that sought to emphasize and elevate the position of influential community members and other local civil society actors. This began with women's groups in Wajir, a region bordering Somalia. So successful were they that in time the Kenyan government sought to institutionalize so-called peace and development committees across other areas of northern Kenya, in essence ceding responsibility to non-state and informal systems to prevent conflict and build peace. The strategy of building peace through influential non-state and informal systems has been referred to as a mediated state model by Ken Menkhaus, in which the state cedes some of its core functions, such as maintaining peace and security, to various local non-state and informal stakeholders. In this approach, the top-down project of building a central government and the organic emergence of informal polities are not viewed as antithetical, but are instead harmonized or nested together in a negotiated division of labor. The state limits itself to a few essential competencies not already provided by local, private sector, or voluntary sector actors. Menkhaus explains that such state-civic partnerships can contribute to building locally recognized and trusted modes of local governance. So-called local mediators gain recognition from the state by providing core functions of public security or other services demanded by local communities, and earning legitimacy as a result. Given the blurring of lines between state and non-state, and formal and informal political actors, as well as the movement of individuals between and across these, a mediated state does not imply a complete reorientation to a different set of local elite actors, much less a shifting of power away from the center. Not only was the institutionalization of district and peace committees in Kenya an acknowledgement of the center's limited capacities for sustained direct intervention and a monopoly of security at the margins, it was also a technique of governance that in practice functioned to extend the state's influence. So we have seen that in many pastoralist areas, security was a project defined and pursued by outside forces through the use of violence. However, such was the paradoxical condition of statehood in pastoralist areas that, while the constitution of power often relied on the state's use of coercion and violence, over time it became framed in terms of the state's absence from people's daily lives. Yet rapid change is now afoot, whether through a mediated state model or recent constitutional reforms that seek to devolve decision-making in public finance, or investment in large-scale infrastructure and resources, as we'll see in the next session. Pastoralist areas are experiencing unprecedented change in their relationship with states. It is still too soon to know how these will ultimately reshape dynamics and patterns of conflict and governance in pastoralist areas, but some of the early signs indicate there are winners and losers, and that peaceful outcomes are not guaranteed. As researchers, in assessing these changes and efforts to reduce conflict and build security, we must be guided by the following three questions that I want to end on. Security for whom? In whose interest? And with what consequences for building peace that is socially just and politically inclusive?